What happens when a former James Bond sits across the table from one of daytime television's most outspoken voices, and the conversation takes a turn nobody in the studio expects? Make sure to subscribe to Chronicle Chat and like and comment for more talk show coverage. So the segment opens the way these things usually do. The music fades, the audience is clapping, and the camera pans across the table. Whoopi Goldberg is sitting in her usual seat, calm, hands folded, giving that half smile she gives when she already knows it might be one of those mornings. The other co-hosts are there, smiling brightly, shuffling their cards. Then Pierce Brosnan walks out to applause that's louder than usual, some of it nostalgic, some of it genuinely excited. Whoopi stands, gives him a hug. "Welcome back, sir." Pierce smiles, polished but relaxed. "It's lovely to be here, Whoopi. Always a pleasure." They sit. The applause fades. One of the co-hosts jumps in first. "Pierce, the new series is getting amazing reviews." "Congratulations." "Thank you," he says, nodding. "It's been a labor of love." For the first few minutes, everything is smooth. They talk about the project, about filming overseas, about how different television production is now compared to when he first started. Whoopi listens, occasionally adding a short comment. The energy is friendly. Then the conversation shifts, subtly at first. One of the co-hosts says, "Your show deals with political corruption and media narratives. Do you think Hollywood is getting too political these days?" There's a slight shift in the air. You can feel it. The audience quiets in that way they do when they sense something might happen. Pierce leans back slightly. "I think art has always been political," he says evenly. "From Shakespeare to now. Storytelling reflects the times." Whoopi nods once. "That's true." But then he continues. "But I also think," he adds, "that sometimes we forget the audience comes to be entertained, not lectured." There's a small ripple in the audience. Not quite applause, not quite discomfort. Just noise. Whoopi tilts her head. "What do you mean by lectured?" Pierce keeps his tone calm. "I mean when storytelling becomes more about messaging than character. When people feel like they're being told what to think." Whoopi responds quickly. "Or when people feel uncomfortable hearing perspectives they don't agree with." The audience reacts, a couple of claps, a couple of murmurs. Pierce doesn't smile this time. Discomfort isn't the same as being preached at. Now one of the other co-hosts tries to lighten it. "Okay, wait. We're 5 minutes in." The audience laughs. But Whoopi doesn't laugh. She looks directly at Pierce. "So are you saying Hollywood is preaching?" "I'm saying," Pierce replies carefully, "that sometimes nuance gets lost. And when nuance is lost, people feel alienated." Whoopi folds her hands on the table. Or maybe people don't like when long-standing power structures are questioned. There's an audible "oh" from somewhere in the audience. Pierce exhales through his nose, not annoyed but measured. "I don't think questioning power structures is the problem. I think oversimplifying people into villains and heroes is." One co-host jumps in, sensing the temperature rising. "But isn't that what storytelling does? Simplify to make a point." "Not good storytelling," Pierce says. The audience claps lightly. Whoopi raises her eyebrow. "So you're saying a lot of current storytelling isn't good?" He hesitates, and that hesitation says everything. "I think," he says slowly, "that some projects prioritize headlines over humanity." The room shifts again. Whoopi leans forward. "That sounds like a criticism." "It is," he says plainly. There's no hostility in his tone. But there's firmness. Whoopi nods once. "Okay, let's talk about it." And now you can feel that we're no longer in promotional interview territory. The smiles are thinner. The co-hosts glance at each other. Whoopi says, "Because from where I sit, for decades Hollywood told one story. One kind of hero, one kind of voice. Now more voices are speaking, and suddenly it's too political." The audience claps louder this time. Pierce listens. He doesn't interrupt. When it dies down, he responds, "I'm not opposed to more voices. I'm opposed to the idea that disagreement equals moral failure." The audience quiets again. Whoopi responds instantly. "Depends on what the disagreement is about." A few people clap at that. Pierce tilts his head slightly. "So if someone disagrees with you, they're morally wrong?" "I didn't say that," Whoopi says sharply. "You implied it." The audience gasps softly. One co-host quickly says, "Okay, let's slow down." But Whoopi holds up her hand. No, it's fine." She turns back to Pierce. "I said it depends on what the disagreement is about. If someone's disagreement is about whether certain people deserve equal rights, that's not just an opinion." Applause breaks out. Pierce nods once. Equal rights aren't debatable. I agree with you there. There's a small release of tension, just a little. But, he continues, when we start labeling anyone who questions a particular approach as immoral, we shut down conversation. Whoopi leans back now. Or we protect people from harmful rhetoric. That assumes disagreement is harm. And that assumes it isn't. The back and forth is sharper now. The pause is shorter. One co-host tries to inject humor. This is why I drink coffee before this show. Some laughter. But it's nervous laughter. Pierce looks directly at Whoopi. Do you think there's room anymore for ideological diversity in Hollywood? Whoopi doesn't blink. Yes. As long as that diversity doesn't come at the expense of someone's humanity. That's a broad line, Pierce replies. So is don't lecture the audience, Whoopi shoots back. The audience reacts loudly, half applause, half murmuring. There's no shouting, no raised voices. But the temperature is undeniably higher. Pierce adjusts his jacket. When I say don't lecture, I mean trust the audience. Show them complexity. Don't tell them what the moral is every 5 minutes. Whoopi responds. And when I say representation matters, I mean some people have been erased for 100 years. So yes, sometimes you have to say it clearly. Another round of applause. Pierce nods slowly. Clarity is good. Condescension isn't. There it is. The word hangs there. Condescension. The audience reacts audibly. Whoopi's expression shifts, not angry but firm. Are you saying people who advocate strongly are condescending? I'm saying tone matters. So does impact. A co-host interjects again. Okay, but let's make this practical. Pierce, have you felt pressure in Hollywood to say things you don't agree with? That question lands heavy. Pierce pauses longer this time. Yes, he says quietly. The audience murmurs. Whoopi watches him closely. Pressure how? Pressure to endorse positions publicly, he says. To make statements. To align. And you didn't want to? I prefer to express myself through my work. Whoopi nods slowly. But silence can also be a statement. Pierce meets her eyes. So can assumption. Another audible reaction. The segment is clearly no longer light morning television banter. One co-host glances at the producer off camera. You can almost see it. They're debating whether to cut to commercial. But Whoopi doesn't move. Let me ask you something, she says. Do you think people in positions of influence have a responsibility to speak out? Yes, Pierce says immediately. When they're informed. A beat. And when they're not, Whoopi asks. They should listen. The audience claps softly at that. Whoopi nods. That's fair. It's the first moment of slight agreement in several minutes. But the tension hasn't gone anywhere. It's just shifted shape. One co-host smiles nervously. Well, we're going to take a quick break before Pierce and Whoopi start their own podcast right here. The audience laughs, louder this time, grateful for release. But as the music starts to cue for commercial, the camera catches one last exchange. Whoopi leans slightly toward Pierce and says, low but audible, we're not done. Pierce gives a small nod. I didn't think we were. And the screen fades to break. The show comes back from commercial with that slightly tighter energy that happens when everyone knows the last segment trended in real time. The audience applause is still warm, but there's curiosity in it now. Whoopi adjusts her cards, but she doesn't look down at them. Pierce sits upright, hands folded, composed, but more alert than before. One of the co-hosts smiles brightly. We are back with Pierce Brosnan, and apparently we opened a door. Light laughter from the audience. Whoopi doesn't laugh this time. We did. She turns to Pierce. You said during the last segment that you felt pressure in Hollywood to align publicly. I want to unpack that because I think people hear that and assume it means something very specific. Pierce nods. That's fair. So be specific, Whoopi says calmly. What kind of pressure? There's no hostility in her voice, but it's direct. The audience quiets again. Pierce takes a breath. There are moments, interviews, panels, award shows, where you're expected to comment on political events. Sometimes in ways that are simplified for headlines. Isn't that part of being a public figure? One co-host asks. It can be, Pierce replies. But there's a difference between speaking authentically and being cornered into sound bites. Whoopi leans forward. But nobody forces you to say anything. No one physically forces you, Pierce agrees. But culturally, there's an expectation. Murmurs ripple through the audience. Whoopi responds quickly. Expectation from who? The audience. Your peers? Studios. All of the above, Pierce says. Another co-host jumps in. But that expectation didn't appear out of nowhere. It's because audiences want to know where people stand. Pierce nods. I understand that. But sometimes not reducing complex issues to 30 seconds is mistaken for avoidance. Whoopi folds her hands again. Or it's seen as privilege. The word lands heavy. Pierce doesn't look away. Explain. Whoopi gestures gently. If you can afford to stay neutral on something that directly affects other people's lives, that's a kind of privilege. There's strong applause from part of the audience. Pierce listens. He doesn't interrupt. And Whoopi continues. For some communities, silence from influential people feels like abandonment. Pierce nods slowly. I hear that. Do you agree with it? Whoopi presses. I agree that representation and advocacy matter, he says. I don't agree that every actor must become a political spokesperson. Audience murmurs again. One co-host adds, but you've used your platform before. You've spoken about environmental issues. I have, Pierce says. Because I've studied them. I've worked with organizations. I feel grounded in that space. So it's about expertise? Whoopi asks. It's about responsibility, he replies. If I speak, I want it to be informed. Whoopi tilts her head slightly. But you don't need a degree in civil rights to say discrimination is wrong. I've never said discrimination is acceptable. I didn't say you did, Whoopi replies quickly. There's that crosstalk moment, both talking at once, both stopping. The audience gives that little oh again. One co-host tries to recalibrate. Let's separate two things. One is moral clarity, basic human rights. The other is policy and politics. Are we mixing those up? Pierce nods toward her. Exactly. Moral clarity is simple. Policy is complicated. Whoopi responds, but policy affects morality in practice. Applause. Pierce exhales slowly. And that's where nuance matters. Whoopi leans back in her chair this time. Here's my concern. When people with large platforms emphasize nuance, sometimes it's used as a shield. It's complicated, can become a way to avoid taking a stand. The audience claps again, louder now. Pierce doesn't flinch. And sometimes take a stand becomes a demand for conformity. That splits the room. Half applause, half uneasy silence. One co-host jumps in quickly. Okay, but conformity to what? Human dignity. To dominant narratives, Pierce replies. Whoopi's eyes narrow slightly, not angry but focused. You think support for marginalized groups is just a dominant narrative? No, Pierce says firmly. I think the way discussions are framed can become rigid. Rigid how? If someone says, I agree with the goal but question the method, they're often labeled as opposition. Whoopi responds immediately. Depends on the method. And who decides that? Pierce asks. The audience quiets almost completely now. It's that kind of silence where you can hear someone cough in the back. Whoopi answers carefully. Communities decide. People who are affected decide. And what if those communities aren't monolithic? Pierce replies. There's a pause. That lands. One co-host looks between them. That's actually a real point. Communities aren't one voice. Whoopi nods slowly. True. But historically, the loudest voices weren't from within those communities. That's the difference. Pierce nods back. And that's changed. Which is good. So what are you pushing back on? Whoopi asks directly. Pierce hesitates, not because he doesn't have an answer, but because he knows the weight of it. I push back on the idea that disagreement equals harm by default. The audience shifts again. Whoopi responds, calm but firm. Words can cause harm. Yes, Pierce agrees. But disagreement isn't automatically violence. That line sparks immediate reaction, scattered. Applause, scattered gasps. Whoopi leans forward again. No one said disagreement is violence. In broader culture, that rhetoric exists, Pierce says. One co-host interjects. But you're not on broader culture. You're here. The audience laughs lightly, easing it for half a second. Pierce smiles faintly. Fair enough. Whoopi looks directly at him. Do you feel censored? There it is. That question hits differently. Pierce pauses longer than he has all morning. I feel cautious, he says finally. Because? Whoopi presses. Because careers can be impacted by perception, he replies. Everyone's career can be impacted by perception, Whoopi says. Yes, Pierce agrees. But some perceptions are shaped instantly by social media storms. Audience murmurs again, this time more in agreement. One co-host nods. Cancel culture. Whoopi immediately reacts. I don't like that term. Pierce raises his hand slightly. Call it accountability culture, then. Accountability for what? Whoopi asks. For statements taken out of context. For questions asked in good faith but interpreted as malice. Whoopi considers that. But sometimes good faith questions are just dressed up prejudice. The audience claps loudly. Pierce nods. Sometimes. Not always. And how do you tell the difference? Whoopi asks. By listening before condemning, Pierce says. Whoopi responds instantly, and by believing people when they say something hurts. They lock eyes for a second longer than television usually allows. One co-host looks visibly tense now. This is why live TV is unpredictable. Nervous laughter from the audience. Pierce shifts slightly in his seat. Let me ask you something, Whoopi. The audience reacts immediately. They love when guests turn the table. Go ahead, she says. Do you think there's space for someone who supports equality but questions certain activist strategies? Whoopi doesn't answer immediately. Yes, she says finally. If the questioning comes with humility. And if it doesn't, then it might not be questioning. It might be undermining. Pierce exhales slowly. See, that's where subjectivity comes in. Everything is subjective to a degree, Whoopi replies. But impact isn't. The co-host on the far end speaks up. Can I say something? I think what Pierce is reacting to is fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Pierce nods. Yes. And what you're reacting to, she says to Whoopi, is fear of people minimizing real harm. Whoopi nods slowly. That's fair. There's a moment, brief but real, where the temperature drops slightly. The audience senses it too. Pierce speaks more softly now. I don't want to minimize anyone's pain. I truly don't. I believe that, Whoopi says. The first clear olive branch of the morning. But, she adds, intent doesn't erase consequence. And consequence should match context, Pierce responds. The back-and-forth rhythm has changed. It's less sharp, more deliberate. One co-host glances at the clock. We have about 4 minutes. You can feel the producers in their earpieces. Whoopi turns slightly toward the camera. This is a bigger conversation than a segment. The audience claps. Pierce nods. It is. Whoopi looks back at him. I don't think you're the villain here. A few people laugh softly. And I don't think you are either, Pierce replies. The audience reacts warmly to that. But, Whoopi continues, when you say Hollywood is lecturing, it can sound like you're dismissing people fighting for change. Pierce responds calmly. And when you say silence is privilege, it can sound like you're dismissing personal boundaries. That lands. There's no applause this time, just quiet. One co-host says gently, maybe the issue isn't speaking or not speaking. Maybe it's how we allow room for different ways of contributing. Whoopi nods. Maybe. Pierce nods too. Maybe. The music cue for wrap-up starts faintly under the conversation. But Whoopi says one more thing before they fully transition. Just understand this. For a lot of people watching, this isn't abstract. Pierce meets her gaze. I do understand that. The camera cuts to a wide shot as applause begins again. This time more measured, thoughtful. And as they prepare to move to the next topic, the tension hasn't exploded. But it hasn't disappeared either. The applause fades, but the energy in the room doesn't reset. You can feel that the audience knows something unresolved is still sitting at the table. One of the co-hosts tries to pivot. So, Pierce, before we run out of time completely, I want to ask about the responsibility of storytelling itself. Because your new series deals with power, corruption, institutions, all of that. Pierce nods. It does. And some would argue, she continues carefully, that telling those stories is political in itself. It is, Pierce agrees. But there's a difference between exploring themes and prescribing conclusions. Whoopi looks at him again. But every story prescribes something. Not necessarily, Pierce says. Some stories raise questions. And leave people without answers? Whoopi presses. Sometimes that's honest, he replies. The audience murmurs thoughtfully. Whoopi rests her chin briefly on her hand. Here's where I think we're circling something. You're advocating for open space, for complexity. But complexity can feel like delay to people who are living in urgency. That line gets strong applause. Pierce nods slowly. Urgency is real. But urgency without reflection can create backlash. There's a split reaction in the audience again. One co-host leans in. Backlash from who? From people who feel unheard, Pierce says. Whoopi responds immediately. Unheard or uncomfortable? Both, he answers. Sometimes discomfort is necessary, Whoopi says firmly. Yes, Pierce agrees. But alienation is counterproductive. The rhythm is quicker now. Less pause between responses. One co-host interjects. Let's talk about social media for a second, because that's where a lot of this plays out. You mentioned storms earlier. Have you personally experienced backlash? Pierce gives a faint smile. Anyone who's been in this industry long enough has. The audience laughs lightly. But yes, he continues. I've had statements pulled apart, reframed, turned into something I didn't intend. Whoopi nods. That happens to us here every week. Audience applause, supportive. So Pierce says. We do, Whoopi replies. But we also know that sometimes the criticism is valid. Absolutely, Pierce says quickly. Criticism is healthy. So what's the line? She asks. The line, he says slowly, is between accountability and punishment. That word, punishment, shifts the mood again. One co-host reacts. Punishment. Yes, Pierce says. When someone makes a mistake and the response is permanent exile. Whoopi shakes her head slightly. I don't see permanent exile very often. The audience murmurs, some agreement, some doubt. Pierce tilts his head. Careers end quietly. Careers also end for other reasons, Whoopi responds. True, he says. But fear changes behavior. Whoopi looks at him steadily. Fear has changed behavior for marginalized people for generations. The audience erupts into applause at that. Pierce nods respectfully. You're right. And that's precisely why I believe we need dialogue instead of rigid camps. One co-host says, but dialogue requires safety. Yes, Pierce agrees. And safety for some groups means strong boundaries, she adds. Pierce pauses. Boundaries are healthy. Walls are not. The audience gives a mixed reaction again. A few claps, a few murmurs. Whoopi leans back, studying him. Do you feel like you're walking on eggshells right now? The audience laughs nervously. Pierce smiles faintly. I'm choosing my words carefully. Because. Whoopi presses. Because I respect the platform, he says evenly. And because nuance can be flattened very quickly. One co-host looks at him. Are you worried about headlines tomorrow? He considers it. Headlines are part of the territory. That's not what I asked, she replies gently. There's a beat. Yes, Pierce says finally. Of course I'm aware of that. The honesty gets a light ripple of applause. Whoopi nods. So are we. And that feels like a small moment of shared reality. But then she adds, the difference is some people don't have the luxury of worrying about headlines. They're worrying about rights. The audience claps loudly again. Pierce responds carefully. And I support rights. Fully. Then say that clearly, Whoopi says. I have, he replies. Say it now. The audience goes very quiet. Pierce looks directly at the camera for a brief second, then back at Whoopi. I support equal rights for all people. Without hesitation. Strong applause fills the studio. Whoopi nods once. Good. There's tension in that good. Not sarcastic, but firm. Pierce continues. But supporting equal rights doesn't mean endorsing every tactic used in their name. The applause softens immediately. Whoopi's eyes narrow slightly again. Such as? He hesitates, not wanting to single out a group. Public shaming as a first resort, he says. The audience reacts audibly. One co-host jumps in quickly. But sometimes public shaming is the only way people are held accountable. And sometimes it becomes mob behavior, Pierce replies. Mob behavior? Whoopi repeats. Yes, he says calmly. The room feels smaller now. Whoopi speaks slowly. That word carries weight. It does, Pierce agrees. And I use it intentionally. A few audience members clap cautiously. Whoopi leans forward again. When institutions fail, people take to the streets. They take to social media. They make noise. That's not a mob. That's democracy. Loud applause. Pierce nods. Peaceful protest is democracy. Harassment is not. And who decides what crosses that line? Whoopi asks again. We all do, Pierce says. That's not an answer, she replies. It's the only honest one, he says. There's a pause, longer than any before. One co-host looks visibly uncomfortable. I think what's happening here is that we're debating systems on a personal level. Whoopi nods. Because systems affect people personally. Pierce responds more quietly now. I've spent decades working with people from every background. I've seen progress. I've also seen division deepen. Division has always been there, Whoopi says. It's just more visible now. Visibility isn't the same as healing, Pierce replies. The audience murmurs again. One co-host says softly, Do you think things are worse now? Pierce thinks for a moment. I think we're more polarized. Whoopi responds immediately. Or more honest. That draws applause. Pierce nods. Perhaps both. The clock is clearly ticking now. You can sense the producers preparing to wrap. Whoopi looks at him and says, I don't think you're afraid of equality. I'm not, he says firmly. I think you're afraid of missteps. Pierce pauses, then nods once. Yes. The honesty shifts the tone again. And I think, Whoopi continues, that fear sometimes reads as resistance. He absorbs that. That may be true. One co-host smiles slightly. That's growth right there. Light laughter. But Whoopi isn't finished. The challenge, she says, is that when people with influence hesitate, people without influence pay the price. Pierce responds gently now. And when conversations become unforgiving, bridges collapse. They hold eye contact again. But this time, it's less confrontational and more reflective. The audience senses it. The room feels thoughtful rather than charged. One co-host looks toward the camera. This is why live conversation matters. Whoopi nods. It does. Pierce adds, even when it's uncomfortable. There's a small ripple of applause. The producer's cue is obvious now, music swelling lightly. But Whoopi turns to Pierce one last time before they transition. I appreciate you staying in it, she says. I respect the conversation, he replies. There's applause, genuine this time. But the atmosphere isn't celebratory. It's heavy, contemplative. As the camera pulls back slightly, you can see audience members whispering to each other, some nodding, some shaking their heads. The conversation didn't explode. It didn't resolve either. And everyone in the room knows it's going to follow them beyond the studio walls. The music swells like it normally does when the show is about to wrap, but instead of moving on to a lighter segment, Whoopi glances toward the producers off camera and then back at Pierce. We've got a couple minutes, she says. Let's not waste them. The audience responds with a mix of applause and anticipation. They know this isn't the usual tidy daytime TV bow. Pierce nods slightly. All right. One of the co-hosts exhales with a half smile. No pressure. Light laughter breaks the tension for a second. Whoopi looks directly at Pierce. I want to be clear about something. I pushed you because when people hear phrases like dominant narrative or mob behavior, it can sound like you're minimizing very real movements. Pierce nods. I understand that. But, she continues, I also hear you saying you're worried about people being afraid to speak. Yes, he says. That's exactly it. The audience is quiet again, not tense this time, just listening. Whoopi rests her hands on the table. Fear is real on both sides. Pierce nods. Agreed. She continues. For some people, fear is about losing reputation. For others, it's about losing rights. There's applause, strong and immediate. Pierce doesn't argue. That's a powerful distinction. And that's why tone matters, Whoopi says. Because when someone with a global platform talks about feeling pressured, it can sound small compared to what other people face. Pierce responds calmly. I don't equate the two. Then say that clearly, she replies. I don't equate career anxiety with systemic injustice, Pierce says plainly. The audience applauds. Again, louder this time. One co-host nods. That clarity helps. But Pierce continues before the moment can settle too comfortably. However, he adds, fear of speaking honestly can still erode trust over time. The applause softens. Whoopi studies him. Speaking honestly is important. But listening honestly is just as important. He nods. Absolutely. And part of listening, she adds, is accepting when someone says that framing hurts. Pierce takes that in. And part of speaking honestly is being able to ask why. The audience murmurs again, divided but engaged. One co-host glances at the clock. We are literally down to 90 seconds. The audience laughs lightly. Whoopi smiles faintly. Live television. She turns to Pierce one more time. I don't think you're the enemy. I never thought you thought that, he replies. Oh, people online will. One co-host jokes, and the audience laughs knowingly. That line lands because everyone in that room understands what's coming next. The clips, the tweets, the headlines. Whoopi looks directly into the camera now. Conversations like this are messy. They're not supposed to be neat. The audience claps. Pierce adds, and disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. Applause again. The music starts to rise, more insistently this time. Whoopi gives Pierce a small nod. Thank you for staying in the seat. Thank you for challenging me, he replies. They shake hands, not dramatically, not theatrically. Just a firm, professional handshake. The audience stands in partial applause as the camera pulls wide. And then the show cuts to commercial. But that's not where it ends. Within minutes of the segment airing, clips start circulating online. Short clips. 10 seconds here. 15 seconds there. One clip isolates Pierce saying mob behavior. Another isolates Whoopi saying silence is privilege. The nuance, the slower parts, the moments of agreement, get less traction. By the time the East Coast broadcast finishes, hashtags are already trending. Some posts praise Whoopi for holding him accountable. Others applaud Pierce for standing his ground. A few call the exchange the most honest daytime TV has been in years. Others accuse both of talking past each other. Audience members who were in the studio begin posting their own videos. One woman says, "It wasn't hostile. It was intense but respectful." Another says, "You could feel the tension in the room." Someone else posts, "This is what real conversation looks like." Entertainment blogs run headlines within the hour. Some frame it as a clash, others as a debate. A few call it a showdown. Backstage, according to staff later, there wasn't shouting. There wasn't drama in the hallway. Pierce reportedly thanked the hosts again before leaving. Whoopi returned to her dressing room and, as she's known to do, took a few minutes alone before meeting with producers. One of the co-hosts later mentions on her own social media that hard conversations are part of the job. By the evening, longer clips begin to circulate, including the moment where Pierce clearly says he supports equal rights without hesitation, and the moment where Whoopi acknowledges fear exists on both sides. Those fuller clips shift some of the online reaction. Not entirely, but enough to complicate the narrative. The next day, talk radio picks it up. Some commentators argue that Hollywood figures should expect scrutiny. Others say the exchange proves there's little room left for nuance in public life. On morning shows, analysts replay the handshake at the end, debating whether it looked genuine. Meanwhile, regular viewers are split. Some say Whoopi was right to press him. Others say Pierce articulated what many feel, but are afraid to say publicly. And a surprising number of comments focus on one thing, that neither of them stormed off. There was no walkout, no yelling, no insults, just tension, disagreement, pushback, and for many viewers, that felt more real than the usual polished segments. A few days later, Pierce appears at a press event for his series. Reporters ask about the interview. He doesn't back away. He says calmly that he values open dialogue and respects platforms that allow disagreement without dehumanization. Whoopi, on the following week's episode, briefly references the exchange. She says, "We can disagree and still sit at the same table." That's the point. The audience applauds. No apology tour. No dramatic fallout. Just a conversation that exposed how fragile and necessary these discussions are. And that's what makes moments like this stick. Not because someone won. Not because someone lost. But because it revealed something real. The tightrope public figures walk, the urgency many communities feel, and the difficulty of balancing both without talking over each other. For the audience in that studio, it was palpable. You could see people leaning forward. You could see some nodding at Whoopi's points, others nodding at Pierce's. You could see the discomfort, but also the engagement. And in an era where so much discourse happens in 280 characters or less, watching two people stay seated and finish the conversation felt significant. Now we want to hear from you. Was Pierce Brosnan raising valid concerns about nuance and public pressure? Was Whoopi Goldberg right to challenge him on privilege and impact? Did the conversation move the needle, or just highlight how divided we are? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Chronicle Chat for more real talk show stories.